السلام عليكم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Good morning, greetings. Thank you very much, Mr. Osman, for that warm introduction. It is indeed a great honor and pleasure to be here today, to be once again in Kuala Lumpur. I've been to this country many times, and I'm very happy to be here today at the invitation of the Penang Institute and the Islamic Renaissance Front. It's even a greater distinction to be here today, to be on the same panel as Professor Farid Al-Altas, a distinguished scholar of Islamic thought and anthropology, and never had the opportunity to meet him in person, but today I have that opportunity, so thank you very much for being here. How does one tackle this beast of violent Islamic extremism? It's a very, very complicated topic, and in order to have a meaningful conversation, let me highlight a few issues. I think by highlighting a few issues, we might have something that we can talk about. Now, there are a number of ways that one can tackle this question. I think that in the 19th and 20th century, when Muslims awoke from their deep slumber, colonization, imperialism, the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate, Muslim thinkers woke up and said something had gone wrong. Okay, everybody knows that story. Several of the speakers referred to that earlier today about the kind of work that reformers like Afghani and Muhammad Abdu and others did. I think the part of the issue that we need to look at is the diagnosis and the diagnostic that those thinkers provided. And we need to think about that diagnosis and whether the diagnosis were correct in the first place. And secondly, we need to revisit that diagnosis and see whether the remedies that were provided, whether those still have legs, or that we need to revisit those remedies. Whenever people talk about extremism, and especially Muslim extremism, there are basically two kinds of responses. There could be many, but the one is to put the blame elsewhere. That Muslim extremism is not isolated, it is part of larger global processes of globalization, economic maldistribution, political defeats that have resulted in certain kinds of pathologies in Muslim societies, and that these pathologies manifest themselves in these forms of violence. In that big diagnostic, this large-scale diagnostic, people put on the table a number of what I call macro issues. The macro issues are the question of colonialism and imperialism, long historical view there, then neo-imperialism, that is post-colonial blues and the domination of large parts of the globe by Western powers, the rise of liberal capitalism, and of course modernity and secularism. Modernity and secularism being some of the issues that have really resulted in part of the stew, this multifaceted, this hydra of a beast that has distorted practices and values in the Muslim world. That is one narrative, that the blame for this comes from elsewhere, and that has been the result of the harvest that we face now. Now, then there are a number of kind of micro issues that I would put as micro issues. That is that part of the problem has been that in the Muslim world itself, the question of governance, the lack of proper governance, and the lack of democracy and the lack of opportunity for Muslims themselves have resulted in a set of frustrations, and those frustrations, and for them to be unable to live out their aspirations, have resulted in these, again, pathological expressions of violence. and that this violence is not indigenous to Islam, it is not inherent in Islam as a religious tradition, but it is about the conditions in which Islam finds itself. Now, this is a kind of a sociological explanation, and there are many more able people on this table, Professor Atas and others, who can elucidate and also inform us about this. I would want to say that yes, there are long-term issues, but my big question is, what about Muslim responsibility? What about Muslim accountability and responsibility? In all those explanations that we have sociological explanations, we have anthropological explanations, but what about a moral response? What about morality? And what is the moral values behind these manifestations? And I think that we need, in my view, we need to revisit those. That what are the kind of grave problems and issues in Muslim society? I do not disagree about the long-term influences. One cannot deny those. But the question is, how does one deal with the conditions that you have, the hand that you have been given, rather than the hand that you wish you had been given? The world, and Muslims are part of it, but the global South have been given a hand of conditions. These are the realistic, objective conditions that you have. The question is that how do you transform your own conditions? The great philosopher, poet of India, Muhammad Iqbal, said it very clearly, that you have to make yourself rise above the conditions. You must make the self rise above the conditions so that before destiny and fate can seal your destiny, before fate seals your destiny, God Himself asks you, what do you want? In other words, you must be so proactive in the conditions of the world that God will Himself, we're using the male referent to God, but God has no him or her or it. God is beyond that. But Allah Himself will ask, what do you want? So Iqbal has already in the beginning of the 20th century urged Muslims to raise themselves up, to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and take control of their conditions rather than being controlled. So I would say that we need to move away from apologetics and move to the real historical conditions that we have. I think the question of the absence of governance, the lack of governance and proper governance in Muslim societies broadly, that we have been dealt a hand of despotism. That throughout the post-colonial period, take Egypt, take Syria, take Iraq, the Muslim heartlands, but you also take East Asia, you know your history better than else, that there's been autocratic and authoritarian regimes for a long time. And these autocratic and authoritarian regimes have their own strategies of how they co-opt progressive forces. And one of the ways that they have managed to co-opt, the authority and the voices of religion. That the voices of religion, which can be a voice of emancipation and a voice of liberation, that the voices of religion had been co-opted and had been domesticated by ruling elites. And in particular, my analysis is that as bad as governance was, what governance did, that it basically subdued certain forms of orthodox Islamic voices. So with the result that the other voice of Islam that did prevail was the non-orthodox, the revivalist voice of Islam. That is, those people who think of political Islam as a solution. So here we can go back to the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Jamaat-e-Islami in India, Pakistan, the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, that became the kind of the counter voice that said, yes, Muslims do have the future, and the future is with Islam, as opposed to secular modernist narratives of governance in the Islamic world, right? So these voices came through, but they were obviously for for a long period, they were banned, they were subject to all forms of constraint, but yet they continued to do their work and mobilize and create an ideal of an Islamic future, a hyper-idealistic Islamic future, in which Sharia is a cornerstone. And this idea of Sharia is an unreconstructed version of Sharia. It's a notion of Sharia that is just picked up from the classical textbooks and say, Sharia is the future. And Sharia is the answer. And Islam, al-Islam huwa al-hal. Islam is the solution. And you need Islamic governance, and once you have control of the state, everything will change overnight. Everything will be better. The moment you cut off people's hands, you flog a few people, all the solutions will be in place. I must confess that I was among those people when I was 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. I was a believer in those kind of things. I now repent. Astaghfirullah. I repent. I had misled a lot of people in my youthful aspiration. But these were the solutions on the table. We were a young person. I was like many of the young people here, 17, 18 years old. I'm becoming aware in the 1975, I finished high school. 74, I finished high school. And I'm thinking about the world. And who am I? What is my identity? I'm a Muslim. I'm living in apartheid South Africa, in a racist South Africa. Who are my heroes and my role models? My role model at one stage is a man called Cassius Clay, who becomes Muhammad Ali. A strong black man with a Muslim name. I take pride in him. What is the other role model? King Faisal. King Faisal imposes the Arab oil boycott because in protest about the West's attitude towards Israel. That is comforting, right? These kinds of actions where Muslim societies are taking their destiny into their own hands. A society, the Saudi Arabia, King Faisal does these things. Or you have people like Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, refusing to be drafted into. So these are very kind of elementary things, but for young people, these are hugely influential things. These are your role models. And you have nothing around you to teach you anything better. So you have power in the glove of Muhammad Ali, strong man, he's a Muslim. And the other, you have the power of boycott. To keep away oil from the Western economies and to make them suffer so that they can change their position. That oil boycott did nothing to change the conditions of Palestinians. And Muhammad Ali, of course, was a great sports person, and he did his thing, and today he's in kind of retirement and also suffering as a result of the kind of the violence that the sport had imposed upon him. But the question is, we had no other solutions in front of us. When I became aware of my Islam, what I had in front of us was Sayyid Qutb and Abul Ala Maududi. Those are the people that were saying the Islamic state, Islamic sovereignty, those are the answers to a Muslim future. Of course, now I've studied Islam, have become a scholar, thought about those issues, and of course I no longer believe those things that I believed in my youth, but really we need to unpack those issues. So the first issue that I said was governance, the lack of proper governance, the lack of just governance, and the lack of just governance then elicits radical alternatives. And these radical alternatives then become unworkable, but they are wonderful utopias to hold on to. And the centerpiece of as part of that utopian project is the question of Islam as a paradigm of ideas, and Sharia at the centerpiece, and Sharia as the answer. And so I think that in my experience, what we really have to revisit is how do we think about Islam? It is about the level of thought. It's a question of the level of thought. Iqbal wrote this book, Reconstruction of Islamic Thought. See, knowledge, there's a difference between knowledge and thought. Knowledge is about that which gives you identity. But thought is that which moves beyond the dimensions of beneath, before, and after. Thought is that moves between ideas to create the possibilities of new thoughts. The possibility of new thoughts. It's a peculiar way of thinking. So Gilles Deleuze is a French philosopher that died. Deleuze, for instance, thinks about that philosophy is about charting new vistas, new futures, new vistas of thought. Once thought gets captured and becomes part of our project, it becomes a knowledge project, then it has an identity. It is Malay, it is Indonesian, it is male, it is female, it is young, it is old, it's about Islam, it's about Christianity, when it has this. But thought as another way of examining and questioning. So one of the things that we need to do, a reconstruction of Islamic thought, Iqbal writes in Reconstruction of Islamic Thought, that we need to revisit the whole of Islamic thought itself. And that's what I'm convinced of, that Iqbal made it very clear. He says very carefully in Reconstruction, nor can concepts of theological systems draped in the terminology of a practically dead metaphysics be of any help to those who happen to possess a different intellectual background. Iqbal says that we have inherited a way of thought that is based on a metaphysics that's no longer alive, it's dead. And we are a people of a new way of thought. We are a product of a history. Now you can run away from that history, or you can confront that history. Today we are speaking here English. It means that we were colonized several hundred years ago. My ancestors came from India into South Africa, English. You were also subject to English and British colonialism. Other parts were Dutch in this region. But the world has changed. We have now become polyglot. We speak multiple languages. Okay? We'll speak Arabic, we'll speak Persian, we speak other languages, Malay, other languages we speak. So we are the heirs of multiple heritages. And so Iqbal is saying that we have to revisit those thoughts the entire thinking must be rethought. And therefore he says the task before the modern Muslim is therefore immense. He has to rethink the whole system of Islam, and here's the interesting part, without completely breaking with the past. That's interesting, that you have to rethink the whole without completely breaking with the past. So he does believe that there must be some continuity, but he also believes there's going to be some discontinuity. And therefore perhaps the first Muslim who felt the urge of a new spirit in him was Shah Waliullah of Delhi, Iqbal writes. The only course open to us is to approach modern knowledge with a respectful but independent mind, independent attitude, and to appreciate the teachings of Islam in the light of that knowledge, even though we may be led to differ from those who have gone before us. These are important words that Iqbal gives. Unfortunately, all the lovers of Iqbal quote Iqbal's poetry about खुदी को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे को खुद पूछे बता तेरा भला क्या है. That that people quote Iqbal saying, make yourself, elevate yourself so high that before God can ask you, what is destiny, you will yourself be the author of your own destiny. And people told, but the hard ideas of Iqbal, most people sweep under the carpet, or they say, Iqbal was a little bit out of touch here, and so many of Islamic orthodoxy who love Iqbal, because Iqbal always talks about, the West is a dangerous place and the West's ideas, but very little do they understand that Iqbal also writes these things. So Iqbal is caught, like us, Iqbal is caught what we call agonism. Agonism means that you're agonizing between different strengths. Today the Muslims' dilemma is Islam agonistes. Agonistes means that you're agonizing between multiple alternatives in front of you, and therefore you have to, the condition is in-betweenness. You're in between many things. It's not the Homi Bhabha who said that you're in between many things. Homi Bhabha is the Indian philosopher at Harvard. But even someone like Al-Ghazali in the 11th century understood that you are between multiple forces, between the legacy of the Greeks that is in front of him, the legacy of thought of Persia, political thought, and the inspiration and the revelation of Muhammad ibn Arabi, Muhammad the Arabian, that inspiration of the Quran revelation. Ghazali understood that this is my legacy. And how do I work those legacies? And therefore Ghazali is caught between multiple tensions. That is precisely why Ghazali is such an interesting figure, that he doesn't have a straight answer to everything, but he's got multiple answers, and he's always struggling to put things together. This is precisely our dilemma. We have multiple, on our table, we have multiple thoughts, and we have to struggle through them. So the problem that we have, coming back, is a problem of thought. And it is this utopian thinking that is basically the root of some of our violence. It begins with a psychological and a mental violence. So for instance, when I opened my eyes in thinking about Islam, and when I read Maududi's book, Islamic Law and Constitution, which was one of the first books that I read, the great notion of that book was that Muslims can produce a society. We can have a state. You feel empowered by it. But then you read him saying that, hands must be chopped off. And people have to be killed. And that militated against my young mind. What kind of God is this that makes people cut off their hands? Or flog adulterers? Now, this kind of speak is kufr speak. You cannot speak this, because Muslim thinkers are going to tell you that challenging this is anti-Islamic. This is Sharia. This is hudud. Challenging the hudud is kufr. What I'm saying is, our experience and our thought tells us that Sharia is something more than just a set of rules. And what I thought at age 17 was that maybe these rules were applicable to a particular culture and society. And the question I had, and I still have, do these rules have traction in the society and in the vision of a society that I aspire for? And I leave you with that question, that you must think and ask yourself honestly whether that is your dilemma too. What we understand is that Sharia, in one sense, is a public order. It's a public order. One dimension of Sharia is a public order. And the public order that Sharia inherits is a public order of a particular historical cultures that evolve over time. This notion of Sharia that we have, the public order, evolves through different cultures and societies over 1400 years. It develops these positions. But there's also the core of the Sharia. The core of Sharia is about makarimul akhlaq, is about developing noble character. And that is the root of Islamic teachings. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. If you read Isfahani, if you read Ghazali, if you read Ibn Rushd, you will see that the core ideas there, Sharia is all about developing excellences within yourself. Is developing character within yourself. That is the core of Sharia. It's not about bloodletting. It's not about chopping off people's heads as a form of justice. And if you look at the student of Ibn Taymiyyah, a man by the name of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Ibn Taymiyyah is like the rock star for the jihadis, right? But many people don't understand Ibn Taymiyyah himself. So it was a vast intellect. Ibn Taymiyyah is not someone that you can play with. He's a very vast and intimidating intellect. He's got a student by the name of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah makes it very clear in two statements that he has in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in and in Al-Turuq al-Hukmiyya, two important books. In both these books, Ibn Qayyim summarizes the essence of Sharia. And he says that the essence of Sharia is about justice. It's about equality. It's about fairness. It's about care. That is the essence of Sharia. It's a long quote. I can give it to you if you want the reference. But that is the core of it. And the way that this happens is that someone, Ibn Qayyim, then records for us a particular insight that comes from Abu al-Wafa ibn Aqil. Abu al-Wafa ibn Aqil was a Hanbali thinker, a little bit a contemporary of Ghazali. in the 11th century. And he was a very cosmopolitan Hanbali thinker, Abul Wafa ibn Aqil. Remember that name. And Ibn Aqil engages with a statement of Shafi'i, the great Imam Shafi'i. Imam Shafi'i says that to the extent that you can only do something that is given in the revelation. Ibn Aqil says to Shafi is long dead, but this is an intellectual argument. If you mean that it must be explicitly stated in the revelation, then I disagree with you. That politics, all the answers in politics cannot be stated in the revelation. But if you think that the purposes, the objectives must be located within the revelation, then I'm with you. The kind of broad purposes, then I'm with you. And that's what Ibn Aqil, that inspires someone like Ibn Qayyim to begin thinking about the essence and core of Sharia. So it is not a Sharia that says the only justice that you can have is cutting off people's hands or ripping off their necks. That there are a variety of ways that you can think through the ways that you can have justice in the world. How you can order the world. That the caliphate is just one way that people did politics at a particular time. And part of the problem that we have, and I know it's a question of time, and I'll wrap up, is that today that what we have as Muslims, we have the nation state. And Muslims are not very clear whether they agree with the nation state or not. And they don't have a proper justification, explanation of how do they deal with the nation state. Because they see the nation state as a product of a European political development that has been thrust upon them. But we must understand that the nation state that we have, even the secular politics that arrives in the Muslim world, arrives here in a different garb. It's not the same secularity of France. It is not the nation state of Britain. It's a different kind of beast that comes here. But it doesn't mean they have to be the same. It is open to reconstruction and remaking. But what we need is a set of conditions to make thinking possible and to make brave thinking possible. Those are the conditions that we do not have. So extremism and violence flourishes in conditions where there is despotism. Because what happens in this, you saw Sheikh bin Bayya in the documentary, Sheikh bin Bayya telling you what the core teachings of Islam, are. It's about goodness. It's about salah. It's about developing goodness in the world. But most of us think that goodness comes pre-packaged from the 7th century. And that it's only when you follow that package and that wrapper of the 7th century that you are going to be in the path of goodness. What we don't understand that Islam encourages us to think through our problems. And that thought and thinking and also adherence to the tradition comes in a combination, and that you are authorized to create new forms of thinking to deal with your historical contingencies. And that is one of the things that I think that is eluding a large sector of Muslim youth. So you have over 900 French Muslims joining ISIS, over 150, 200, 300, God knows how many from Britain. A number of them want to escape from America to go there. A number of them want to escape from Malaysia to go to the new frontier of the caliphate and do jihad in Iraq and Syria. Meanwhile, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's wife has left the caliphate and is in Lebanon, in multicultural, multi-religious Lebanon. God knows what she's doing there. Maybe she had a fight with her husband and she left the household. Maybe he will invite her back. I don't know what's going on. But the question is that the seriousness is, why do these Muslim youth want to go and create an ideal society in Iraq and Syria? Many of them can't even speak the language. Why don't they create and put the energies of making a better Britain, a better France, a better Indonesia, Malaysia, or South Africa? Well, part of the problem is a certain kind of alienation. They don't identify with Britain. They don't identify with France. Half of those people who are in ISIS in France, from France, half of them spend time in jails. Hardened criminals, they've fallen through the cracks of that society. Many of them come from poor backgrounds. Many of those who want to leave from here are in search of some kind of utopia and utopian thinking, even though they might have enough in Malaysia to take care of them. But it's this utopian thinking that drives them. The question is that how does one alter and switch those energies from destructive to constructive energies? That is the key question that is in front of us. And for that, you require much more thinking that we can do. Lastly, that the big thing that has gone, that all the energies and all the intellectual energies that have been spent in the 20th century on remaking the Muslim self was largely about thinking about the system, the political system, systemic thinking. And in that systemic thinking, I think that was not very good systemic thinking either. We have come up with very bad alternatives. But what we have missed, the biggest loss has been the lack of attention to the self. The making of a good self. A self that is caring. A self that is generous. A self that can feel the pain of others. A self that is charitable. This thing of innama bu'ithtu li utammima makarim al-akhlaq, that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that I've been dispatched to usher humanity into the perfection of character and excellence. That we have lost. So in systemic thinking, we have lost the self. So when you have an Egypt, on 25th of January, millions of people rise, 2011, they rise to overthrow despotism. In Tunisia, in Bahrain, in Yemen. But less than 2 years later, those same people turn against their emancipators and liberators and say, bring back the army. It was the people who asked for the army to be back. We cannot just keep on blaming systems and conspiracies. One of the things that we are very good at is conspiracy theories. That now become the solution to all problems. But let me not get onto that. But what has happened is that you can have emancipation, you can have independence, but if you don't have good human beings, you can do nothing with those systems. You can do nothing with those countries. And my pain is we have lost something. We have lost the creation of good human beings that can stand up, or human beings that can be judicious, that when we have tyranny, I don't have to put my breast in front of tyranny and get myself killed, but how do I create micro societies that one day will overthrow these tyrannies in a much more easier way? See, my mentor at one stage was a man called Muhammad Fatih Usman. The last time I met Fatih Usman was here in Kuala Lumpur when we were both here for Islam Hadari conference. And Fatih Usman always used to say that, we have too many martyrs already. He used to say it in his very kind of francophone, French, Egyptian accent. Ibrahim, we have too many martyrs. We have too many martyrs. We have too many martyrs. We need to be people who can live, to enjoy tomorrow. This notion of martyrdom is too much in us. And I think that we have misunderstood martyrdom. Martyrdom is a desperate act of people when your very existence is at stake. I don't understand what kind of existence of those Malaysians running from here to ISIS, what of their existence is at stake. I don't understand that. These are losers who are running away from their problems. That's a loser Islam. Those who are running away and don't want to make their society in France, in England, in South Africa, in Somalia and so on, want to run away and do jihad elsewhere, we need to ask whether there's not a loser syndrome that goes under the name of an Islamic syndrome. And of course, the other manifestation, and I'll just highlight this and end up, is that the absence of equity on the global level really inflames a lot of people. And not only Muslims, the way in which global inequity, violence in Israel, Afghanistan, Iraq, other parts of the world, by global powers, excluding the United States and the West, they must take responsibility, and we need to call them out on that. That also is also another engine of a great deal of grievances and so on. But that doesn't mean that you have to go on a suicidal path. What you have to do is to create alternatives, and alternatives that will be meaningful and intelligible and workable, not utopias that can never be realized, and in which you and your entire societies throw yourself into a suicidal path. That is not the way forward. And I believe that Muslims can do and can chart out for themselves a different future, and I'm hopeful about that. And thank you very much for inviting me.